What if the person who was supposed to bring peace into a broken family ended up standing right at the center of its biggest divide? For years, viewers of Little People, Big World watched the Little People, Big World family grow, struggle, and evolve, right there on Roloff Farms. And when Amy Roloff and Matt Roloff went their separate ways, it felt like the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. Then came Chris Marek. Calm, supportive, steady. To many, he seemed like exactly what Amy needed. A fresh start, a grounded partner, someone far removed from the tensions of the past. But as time went on, subtle cracks began to show. Because when major decisions about the farm started unfolding, when conversations turned into conflicts, and when Zach Roloff's reported $2.2 million opportunity began slipping out of reach, fans started asking questions. Was Chris really just a bystander in it all? Or was he more involved than anyone realized? Did he stay neutral? Or did his presence quietly influence decisions that would reshape the future of the Roloff family forever? In today's video, we're diving deep into the moments that sparked controversy, the choices that changed relationships, and the tension that may have drawn a line that can't be undone. Because sometimes, the biggest shifts in a family don't happen loudly. For the Little People, Big World audience, Roloff Farms was never just a backdrop. It was the emotional center of everything. Long before family tensions made headlines, the farm represented stability. It was where milestones unfolded, where traditions were built, and where viewers watched a family grow, struggle, and evolve in real time. Every pumpkin season, every family gathering, every quiet conversation on that land added another layer to what the farm meant, not just to the Roloffs, but to the millions watching. Financially, the farm wasn't small either. Over the years, it transformed into a thriving business, especially during pumpkin season, when thousands of visitors would pass through. What started as a simple piece of land became a carefully built operation, one that generated real income and long-term opportunity. For Matt Roloff, it was a vision brought to life through years of work, risk, and expansion. And for Amy Roloff, it was deeply tied to family, motherhood, and memory. But the real weight of the farm wasn't in dollars, it was in expectation. For years, there was an unspoken understanding that one of the next generation would eventually take over. And among all the possibilities, Zach Roloff seemed like the natural choice. He had the strongest emotional connection to the land. He had lived it, worked it, and in many ways embodied the continuation of what the farm stood for. Viewers saw that connection. The family talked about it. And slowly, that idea started to feel less like a possibility and more like a promise. But here, where the tension begins to build. Because when something is treated as a legacy instead of just property, the stakes change completely. This wasn't simply about who could afford it or who made the best business decision. It was about identity, about belonging, about who gets to carry forward something that represents decades of family history. And that's what made everything that followed so complicated. Because when expectations are left unspoken for too long, they don't just disappear, they solidify. So when the time finally came to make real decisions about the future of the farm, it was never going to feel like a normal transaction. There was too much history, too much emotion, too much meaning tied into every acre of that land. This wasn't just a sale. It was a test of what mattered more, business or family legacy. And once that line starts to blur, there's no easy way to separate the two. For years, the idea felt almost inevitable. Out of all the Roloff children, Zach Roloff seemed like the natural successor to the legacy of Roloff Farms. He had grown up on that land. He understood its rhythms, its history, its meaning, not just as a business, but as the emotional center of the family. And alongside him, Tori Roloff wasn't just supportive, she was fully invested. Together, they didn't just see a property. They saw a future. A place where their kids could grow up surrounded by the same traditions. A place where the next chapter of the Roloff story could continue, naturally, organically, almost as if it had always been leading to this. So when conversations began about actually buying a portion of the farm, it didn't feel surprising. It felt like the plan, finally becoming real. But then came the number. $2.2 million. That figure quickly became the focal point of everything, not just a price tag, but a symbol. A line between what Zach believed was fair and what Matt Roloff believed the property was worth. And this is where things started to shift. Because from the outside, it might look like a straightforward business negotiation. Land, value, assets, logistics. But inside the family, it was anything but simple. For Zach, this wasn't just about buying property. It was about stepping into a role he thought he'd been preparing for his entire life. There was an expectation, spoken or not, that the farm would stay in the family and, more specifically, pass into hands that truly understood what it meant. So when negotiations began, there was more than money on the table. There was legacy, identity, belonging. Reports and discussions suggest that those negotiations didn't just stall. They broke down. Differences in valuation, disagreements over terms, conflicting visions for what the farm should become. And slowly, what once felt like a shared goal started to feel like opposing sides. For Zach, the experience reportedly became deeply personal. Because at some point, it stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling like a rejection. A sense that despite years of connection to the farm, despite being one of the most involved in its day-to-day life, he wasn't being prioritized in the way he had expected. That maybe, in the eyes of his father, he wasn't the right person to carry it forward. And that emotional shift, that's the turning point. The moment where hope begins to give way to frustration. Where excitement turns into confusion, and confusion turns into distance. Because when something you believed was part of your future suddenly feels out of reach, not because you walked away, but because the path changed, it hits differently. It lingers. For Zach Roloff and Tori Roloff, the $2.2 million figure didn't just represent a deal that didn't happen. It represented a door that quietly, but firmly, closed. And from that moment on, the conversation around the farm was no longer about when they would take over. It became about why they never would. When Chris Marek entered the Roloff family dynamic, he didn't just step into a relationship. He stepped into a history that was already layered with emotion. Unresolved tension and years of public scrutiny. This wasn't a blank slate. Amy and Matt had decades of shared experiences, and their children, especially Zach, had grown up with a strong sense of what the farm represented. So naturally, Chris's presence raised an important question. Where exactly did he fit within all of this? At first, Chris appeared to take a careful, measured approach. On screen, he often came across as calm, respectful, and intentionally neutral. He wasn't part of the original conflicts, and he didn't have the same emotional ties to the farm. That distance could be seen as a strength. It allowed him to observe without being immediately pulled into the tension. But at the same time, it also meant he was navigating relationships that had long-standing, deeply rooted expectations. His dynamic with Matt Roloff was particularly interesting. Despite the complicated history between Amy and Matt, Chris maintained a relatively cordial relationship with him. They shared scenes together that felt surprisingly comfortable, even friendly at times. For some viewers, that was a positive sign, an example of maturity and moving forward. But for others, it raised eyebrows. Was Chris simply being diplomatic, or was there a level of alignment forming that wasn't fully visible on the surface? Then there's his relationship with Amy's sons, especially Zach. Compared to his interactions with Matt, Chris's connection with the boys seemed more reserved. Not necessarily negative, but quieter, less defined. And in a situation where family decisions, like the future of the farm, carry so much emotional weight, even subtle differences in closeness or communication can start to feel significant. There were moments in the show where Chris appeared to stay out of direct conflict, choosing instead to support Amy without openly challenging or reinforcing the perspectives around her. But that's where interpretation comes in. Some viewers saw this as respectful, allowing Amy to make her own decisions. Others wondered if his influence was more behind the scenes, not controlling, but perhaps guiding. offering opinions in private conversations that subtly shaped how Amy approached certain situations. That brings up one of the more debated questions among fans. Was Chris influencing Amy's perspective during the farm negotiations? There's no clear on-screen evidence that points to direct involvement, but influence doesn't always look obvious. In relationships, especially serious ones, perspectives often evolve through conversation, reassurance, and shared thinking over time. It's also worth considering the position Chris was in. Supporting Amy likely meant understanding her feelings, her past with Matt, her emotional connection to the farm, and her role as a mother. If Amy felt a certain way about the negotiations or about how things were unfolding with Zach, it would be natural for Chris to validate those feelings. The question is whether that validation stayed supportive or unintentionally reinforced a particular stance. Ultimately, Chris's role sits in a gray area. He wasn't at the center of the conflict, but he wasn't completely outside of it either. His presence added a new layer to an already complex family dynamic, and depending on how you interpret the moments shown on screen, he can come across as neutral, supportive, or quietly influential. And maybe that's why this question matters so much. Because when emotions are high and decisions carry long-term consequences, even the quietest voice in the room can have more impact than it seems. But here, where things start to get complicated, and where perception begins to shape reality. For a segment of the fan base, Chris didn't just remain a neutral figure in the background, he became something else entirely. In online discussions, comment sections, and fan theories, a narrative began to take hold. That Chris, intentionally or not, had betrayed Amy's sons. Now, to be clear, this isn't about confirmed actions or explicit statements. It's about interpretation, about how certain moments were perceived by viewers who were already emotionally invested in the outcome of the farm negotiations, especially when it came to Zach. Because when Zach's attempt to purchase part of the farm fell through, emotions were already running high. Fans weren't just watching a business deal collapse, they were watching what many believed was a lifelong expectation slip away. And in moments like that, people naturally look for someone to blame, or at least someone who could have stepped in and didn't. Chris, for some viewers, became that person. There were instances where Chris appeared supportive of Amy's decisions, particularly her choice to move forward, sell her portion of the farm, and fully embrace a new chapter of life. From one perspective, that's what a supportive partner does. He stood beside Amy as she made choices that were right for her future. But from another perspective, those same moments felt different. To some fans, Chris's support of Amy's independence looked like a lack of advocacy for her sons' interests, especially when those interests were tied so deeply to the farm. When Zach's negotiations with Matt reportedly began to fall apart, viewers didn't see Chris stepping in, questioning the situation, or pushing for a different outcome. And that silence stood out. Because in emotionally charged family situations, silence is rarely neutral, at least not in the eyes of those watching. To some, it felt like agreement, like quiet alignment with decisions that ultimately didn't benefit Zach. But here, the key question, was Chris ever in a position to influence those outcomes in the first place? It's easy, from the outside, to assume that proximity equals power. That because Chris was close to Amy, and Amy was close to her children, he somehow had a role to play in the dynamics between them. But real-life relationships don't always work that way. Chris entered a family with years, decades of history, tension, expectations, and unspoken dynamics. The negotiations over the farm weren't just about land or money. They were about legacy, identity, and long-standing family roles. Those are not spaces an outsider can easily step into, or even should. So when fans interpret Chris's neutrality as betrayal, it raises an important distinction. Are we seeing what actually happened, or are we projecting what we hoped would happen? Because for many viewers, the ideal scenario was clear. Zach takes over part of the farm, the legacy continues, and the family finds a way to move forward together. And when that didn't happen, it created a gap between expectation and reality. Chris, fairly or not, ended up in that gap. there's also the emotional layer between Amy and her sons to consider. As Amy moved into a new phase of life, new home, new marriage, new priorities, there may have been an unspoken shift. Not necessarily a distancing, but a redefining of roles. And for her sons, who had long associated their family identity with the farm, that shift may have felt jarring. In that context, Chris's presence can be seen in two very different ways. On one hand, he represents stability and support for Amy, someone encouraging her to move forward after years of difficulty. On the other hand, to some viewers, he symbolizes that shift away from the past, including the version of the future that her sons once imagined. And that's where the idea of betrayal becomes less about actions and more about emotion. Because betrayal, in this sense, isn't necessarily about someone doing something wrong. It's about the feeling that something important wasn't protected, that an expectation, spoken or unspoken, wasn't upheld. But feelings don't always reflect intent. There's no clear evidence that Chris acted against Zach or deliberately influenced outcomes in a negative way. What we do see is a man who consistently supported his partner, stayed largely out of conflicts that weren't his to lead, and maintained a calm, measured presence throughout. And yet, in a story filled with high emotions, shifting expectations, and unresolved tensions, even calmness can be misread. So the real takeaway here isn't whether Chris betrayed anyone. It's how easily narratives can form when emotions are high and outcomes don't match expectations. Because what viewers saw on screen was only part of the story, and what they felt filled in the rest. And this is where the story stops being about a deal and starts becoming about distance. Because after everything fell apart, the shift wasn't just emotional, it became physical. Zach and Tori didn't just walk away from the negotiation, they stepped away from the entire farm dynamic. What was once a central gathering place, a symbol of family, tradition, and shared history, suddenly became something else entirely, a place tied to disappointment, to what could have been. Their move created more than just miles between them and the farm. It created space, intentional or not, between relationships that once felt tightly bonded. And for fans who had watched this family operate as a unit for years, the change felt undeniable. What used to look like frequent interactions, shared moments, and a sense of closeness began to feel more distant, more selective, more complicated. And at the center of it all stood Amy. For the first time, she wasn't just navigating a separation from Matt, she was now caught between two sides of a growing divide. On one hand, her son, who felt hurt, overlooked, and shut out of something deeply meaningful. On the other, her husband, who had his own perspective on how things unfolded and why. That position isn't just difficult, it's deeply emotional. Because no matter what she says or does, there's the risk of it being interpreted as choosing a side. Supporting Zach could feel like undermining Chris. Standing by Chris could feel like distancing from her son. And even neutrality can feel like silence to someone who's hurting. That's where the emotional weight of this situation really settles in. Because this wasn't just a disagreement that ended when the deal fell through. It lingered. It reshaped how often the family connected, how they showed up for each other, and how comfortable those interactions felt moving forward. Moments that once seemed effortless now carried tension. Conversations that once felt natural now required care. And over time, those subtle shifts can turn into something bigger, something harder to repair. What makes this even more complex is that from the outside, it's easy to look for a single turning point. One decision, one conversation, one moment where everything changed. But in reality, it's rarely that simple. It's a series of decisions, a buildup of emotions, a mix of expectations, assumptions, and perspectives that don't quite align. And when those things collide, especially in a family, they don't just disappear. They ripple. They affect how people communicate, how they interpret each other's actions, how willing they are to show up, to trust, to stay connected. And sometimes, those ripples create distance that isn't easy to close. Because at the heart of it all, this wasn't just about land. It was about legacy, identity, belonging. And when something that meaningful slips away, not just financially, but emotionally, it can change how people see each other, how they relate to each other, and how close they're willing or able to be moving forward. That's the real aftermath. Not just a deal that didn't happen, but a family that hasn't quite felt the same since. In the end, this story was never just about land. It wasn't just about money, or even a deal that didn't go through. It was about expectations. It was about what happens when family, business, and new relationships collide, in ways no one fully sees coming. Because when emotions are tied to something as deeply personal as legacy, every decision carries weight far beyond what's said out loud. Whether Chris Marek truly betrayed anyone, or simply did his best to navigate an already complicated situation, really comes down to perspective. Because what one person sees as support, another might see as silence. And what feels like neutrality can sometimes feel like taking sides. But no matter where you stand on it, one thing is undeniable. The dream that once brought the Roloff family together now seems to have created distance that isn't easily undone. And maybe that's the part that lingers the most. Because sometimes, the hardest thing isn't losing the opportunity itself. It's coming to terms with the fact that the future you believed in was never going to unfold the way you imagined. And that realization can change everything. Thanks for watching. And until next time,